Hello and welcome to the April 2021 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Ibrahim Warde, who's adjunct professor of international business at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. In this month's edition of the paper, Ibrahim has written about US foreign policy in the Middle East in a piece entitled Biden and Iran, Who Trusts Who? He asks, what inheritance has Donald Trump left his successor? And what clues are there so far as to the Biden administration's stance towards the wider region? 3 years ago, Trump withdrew the US from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed stringent sanctions. The deal still exists. 6 of its 7 signatories remain, but it is, as Ibrahim Warde points out, on life support. Biden's choice of Robert Malley as his Iran envoy, and therefore the person to re-engage in negotiations with the Islamic Republic, has been one of his most controversial appointments. It aroused strong criticism from the right, who fear he'll prove too emollient. We'll talk about the man and his mission. We also talk about US relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel under Biden. But when I called Ibrahim earlier this month, I started by asking him about another inheritance from Trump, the Abraham Accords between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the US. Should they be chalked up in the credit column?
Well, in some ways it is an achievement because it's been quite elusive getting Arab countries to sign any kind of agreement with Israel. And in this instance, the word normalization was used, which is, I don't know if it is excessive or not, but certainly in terms of being able to fly to each other's country, to get visas, to conduct business, etc. So from one perspective, it is quite an achievement. So 4 countries did that, starting with the UAE, then Bahrain, then Sudan, and then Morocco. And then there are a few others that are being discussed. So one way of looking at those agreements is that, especially with Gulf countries, and to some extent with a country like Morocco, it's a way of officializing something that already existed. So there have been, for the past few years, a number of direct business contacts between Gulf countries, including actually Saudi Arabia, which is not part of those Abraham Accords, and especially in the field of security. So, and this was always an open secret, that there were ties between Israel and some Arab countries. So what Jared Kushner did was essentially get into business deals or business-oriented deals. And here all the protagonists belong to a very narrow group of people who think alike. And so there are 2 diplomats. I won't get into the names and the details, but basically when Trump became president, the 2 people he named to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflicts were former employees of the Trump company. One of them technically was just the bankruptcy lawyer of Donald Trump, which he had many occasions to use. The other was just a top executive of the Trump organization. And so these 2 people were also very marked ideologically, and then they were both very close to Benjamin Netanyahu, but also they had a very specific agenda in terms of the settlements. And so they would be categorized as very right-wing in terms of Israeli politics. In addition to these individuals, there was a very prominent donor who was technically American. His wife was actually Israeli, and his name is Sheldon Adelson. And Sheldon Adelson turned out to be Trump's largest financial backer. So he gave huge amounts of money to Donald Trump. And Adelson was almost obsessed with the question of moving the capital to Jerusalem. And then on the Arab side, there were a few individuals who also played an important role. So the two crown princes, MBS, of course, of Saudi Arabia, who ended up having a very close personal relation with Jared Kushner. And then lesser known, but no less important, was Mohammed bin Zayed, so-called MBZ, who did the same thing in the UAE. Then there was an assortment of business people who had something to obtain for themselves and their businesses out of those deals. And that was essentially the group of people who put together those Abraham Accords. So depending on how you look at it, it's either a great achievement or a formalization of something that already existed, or more business-oriented deals within a very small group of protagonists.
We know that the Trump administration saw the world in very transactional terms, didn't it? You mentioned there the move of the US Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So that's another inheritance that Biden has from the Trump administration. That's not going to change. That's something that's been ratified by the Senate.
That's right. President Biden, or then candidate Biden, had made that very clear, that he would build upon those agreements and those decisions having to do with moving the capital to Jerusalem, but also the Golan Heights. And so basically everything Netanyahu wanted, Netanyahu got. And one of the criticisms of the way in which Donald Trump operated was that despite the fact that he kept touting himself as the great deal maker, he got nothing in return. He asked nothing in return. Whereas what most sensible people would say about those decisions is that they're not in and of themselves bad, but Donald Trump could have extracted some concession to the Palestinians in exchange for those huge concessions that he made for Israel.
You mentioned also the close relationship that Jared Kushner, acting for the administration, developed with the Saudi crown prince. And I wondered, is another inheritance from the Trump administration that the Saudis thought they could act with impunity? And I'm thinking about the Khashoggi murder, and I'm thinking about their actions, leading the coalition against Yemen. How the Trump administration kind of encouraged the Saudis, or allowed the Saudis to think that they really could act with impunity.
Very much so. And actually, there are two interesting statements that were made in that respect. The Saudi crown prince had actually said at one point, "I have Kushner in my pocket." There's another interesting statement which appeared in the Bob Woodward book, whereby Donald Trump is saying basically that the Saudis owe him everything. And he said that, I don't know if it's allowed on your podcast, but basically Donald Trump told Bob Woodward about MBS, "I saved his ass," in connection with the Khashoggi murder. So the fact that impunity was decided by Donald Trump was seen also as part of this transactional system. And there are also lots of side business deals that are just too narrowly focused to talk about. But all this was part of the bigger package.
Would it be true to say that we're still in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, but we're already beginning to see some pushback on that attitude to Saudi Arabia, that more than just rhetoric?
Very much so. And actually, one concrete step taken by President Biden was basically that he would no longer deal with MBS. He said it is actually improper to do that. I'll deal with an equal, namely with the king. And that was already a huge difference because the king is quite elderly and it is really unclear what his cognitive abilities are at this time. But the fact that Biden made that very clear is quite significant.
I guess, though, important, although all those things we've just talked about are, the really big one is the Iran deal, which Trump made plain he was opposed to really from the start, and from which he withdrew the US in 2018. Now, you say that that deal is not dead, but it is on life support. So that's clearly, in terms of thinking about the whole region, that is clearly, the most significant inheritance that Biden has.
Yeah, to put it in a broader perspective, one thing that's also interesting is that Trump tried to undo everything that Obama did. So if you look at every achievement, whether in the domestic realm or, like, for example, the Obama healthcare system, which was another obsession of Trump, to undo it, but without having anything to substitute for it. So the same thing happened in the international realm with kind of agreements with Cuba, etc. You go down the list. But the most significant one was definitely the Iran deal. And here, there's an interesting discrepancy between the way in which Trump tended to perceive the deal, which was as an American-Iranian deal, where the reality of the deal, which is known as the JCPOA, is that it does involve many other parties, basically the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. And so all of those other players, which kind of therefore include Russia and China, are quite significant in terms of this deal. But Trump keeps talking about it as if there were only 2 parties to the deal. So technically, the fact that the U.S. got out of the deal meant that the deal still remained in place with the other members of that deal. And it's not very clear how much Trump understood about that.
Yeah, things in the Trumpian world were pretty bilateral, weren't they, in the way that he conceived them? There was zero sum. That was how he saw the world. Now, clearly, every appointment Biden has made has been picked over in order to try to read significance into it, about what it says about his intentions and how his presidency is going to play out. In the foreign policy sphere, they've largely been uncontroversial, with one exception, which is germane to what we're talking about today, which is his appointment of Robert Malley as envoy for Iran. So for people who are perhaps not familiar with Robert Malley and his background, can you say a little bit about that and why that has proved a particularly controversial appointment?
Well, he's a very interesting person because his background is quite unusual. He was born in Egypt, in an Egyptian Jewish family. And then his father was a well-known journalist who had been quite sympathetic to Algeria in its national liberation fight. And he had started a publication, etc. And at one point, I think he was expelled from the region. There were kind of multiple expulsions out of Egypt originally, etc. And then he grew up largely, so Robert Malley grew up largely in France, which is where he met with Anthony Blinken, whose stepfather lived in France, and they went to school together, the equivalent of kind of in their teenage years. And so
Blinken, the Secretary of State.
The current Secretary of State, yeah.
Yeah.
The part that is interesting in terms of the Malley story is that he was not very well known as a political figure because his main achievement was the JCPOA, that deal, which happened mostly behind the scenes. And the person who took the most credit for it was the former Secretary of State, John Kerry. So Robert Malley is not a household name. But then for those who follow closely the questions of the Arab-Israeli conflict, etc., what they remember from Robert Malley is some writings that were seen as controversial. Specifically, he had written a couple of articles and kind of actually a few more on unrelated topics for the New York Review of Books. And in one of his articles, he went against the dominant pro-Israel narrative about the failed 2000 attempt by Bill Clinton to come to an agreement, to a broad agreement on the Arab-Israeli issue. And the official line was that Israel had made a very generous offer that Arafat refused. This is the standard line. So Robert Malley had written a few articles trying to provide a different narrative, which was to say that it is really not true that there was a very quote-unquote generous offer on the table. So this is really what turned Robert Malley into kind of a bit of a controversial figure, because he had gone against this dominant narrative. And so prior to his being picked by now President Biden as the special representative for Iran, and incidentally, this is a position that doesn't require Senate confirmation, there were still attacks in the media against Malley, saying that Malley is going to be picked for that position. And again, the main accusation was that Malley is likely to be too soft on Iran and too prompt to make a deal. So this is briefly the background of Robert Malley. But otherwise, he's an eminently qualified person for that role. He knows many of the actors, and he has proved to be very effective as a negotiator. But still, I think that the main criticism of him is that he's likely to come to an agreement.
So the American right, the hawks, are fundamentally opposed to any kind of revival of the Iran deal. Would it be fair to say that?
That would be fair.
Is sort of adding fuel to the fire, because Malley to them represents someone who might be too conciliatory, as they would see it, to Iran. But in fact, any attempt to get it off the ground again, or to get the US reinserted into it, would be taken as provocative to them.
Very much so. And what the listeners should be aware of is that there are still quite a few people in the US, certainly they were quite dominant in the Trump administration, who did not want an agreement with Iran because what they wanted was quote-unquote regime change in Iran. That is, their objective was to get the Islamic Republic out of the picture, to get a different regime in place. One thing that this faction of public opinion and public policy doesn't take into account is the fact that the more the US calls for regime change, the less likely it is to happen, despite the fact that there's obviously a huge segment of the Iranian population who is very dissatisfied with the regime in place. But coming from a US perspective, a recommendation that you should change regime, any kind of regime that would be actually approved by the US would almost by definition be rejected by the Iranians.
And of course, things didn't stay still in Iran during the Trump years. Things were evolving within the country and also in response to what was happening outside the country and what was being done to the country. And I wondered, do you think Iran is a much more difficult country to negotiate with now than it was before as a result of what's happened internally and externally?
Very much so. Because basically the label given to the US policy towards Iran was maximum pressure. So it took the form of a constant addition of new sanctions to the existing ones. The way in which the Iranians responded to this policy of maximum pressure was to stress what they call in Iran the resistance economy, which is basically a way of saying, well, we're used to sanctions and we'll live with them. We won't make any political concessions. So the fact that, again, the policy was not very concrete in terms of what the Trump administration wanted. There were actually two factions, if I can elaborate on that for a minute, in the US. You had what the real hawks, people like John Bolton, who had been the national security advisor, or people like Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State. What they really wanted was regime change. They wanted to have the Islamic Republic get out of the picture. What Donald Trump wanted, and some of his supporters wanted, they didn't care much about the ideological element. What they wanted was a deal that would be signed by Donald Trump himself. So one aspect that is interesting is that despite the demonization of the Iranians, Donald Trump kept sending signals to the Iranians that he wanted to negotiate one-on-one with President Rouhani. There was kind of one documented attempt to use President Macron of France to broker a meeting between Donald Trump and President Rouhani when both of them happened to be in New York for the General Assembly of the UN. And it failed in the last minute, but it was apparently seriously considered by both. And Donald Trump was supposed to be waiting in his room for President Rouhani to show up. So again, there were those two different perspectives in the US, one that was purely ideological and one that was much more Trumpian in terms of having the photo op and the achievement of a deal that bore the signature of Donald Trump himself and not his predecessor.
And we could kind of call that the North Korea paradigm, couldn't we? I guess he was trying to achieve there what he was also trying to achieve with North Korea and failed. And I think you say in your article that hardliners within the Iranian regime kind of look to North Korea and say, well, they decided to hold out and keep their nuclear weapons and not take what was being offered by Trump.
Very much so. And the Iranians do have a point because they say, we fulfilled our part of the deal. And it's the US that decided to get out of the deal. And then they tend to give a few examples when you look closely at what the Iranians were saying. One was, why should we trust the Americans? Because we may sign a deal right now, and then a future administration may renege on that deal. And then the other example they would give is the North Korean example, because in North Korea, as you know, there was, and here it's not an exaggeration, since these were the words used by Donald Trump, there was a love story between the two leaders. And Donald Trump was essentially promising the North Korean that they would have such a large amount of money to rebuild North Korea and to repurpose the economy towards tourism, etc. And yet that was not attractive enough for the North Koreans, who felt that a better protection for them was to keep working on their nuclear weapons. And then again, when you dig a bit deeper into what the Iranians were saying, they would give other examples. Like, for example, Libya. When Libya abandoned its nuclear program, it was followed in short order by, again, the civil war and the outside invasions, etc. So the hardliners in Iran do have a point, and they seem to be currently in the lead for the upcoming elections. So again, there's a presidential election in June in Iran, and the hardliners seem to be reasonably well positioned. There are also going to be some parliamentary elections, mostly by-elections, because a number of members of parliament have died of COVID. So there are going to be a number of elections during which this divide between hardliners and moderates will come to the fore.
So do you think anything significant will happen before the presidential election in Iran, or is that unreasonably optimistic?
I really have no way of knowing what's happening behind the scenes. And clearly there's a talented team of specialists, again, on the American side, led by Robert Malley. And it's very difficult to again figure out what is happening in Iran. But clearly, Iran must be tempted on some level to have the removal of sanctions. The Iranian economy has been suffocating because of all of those sanctions kind of piled upon one another. So one could see that many in Iran feel that the removal of sanctions is enough of a carrot to get them to the table, while the hardliners are offering the opposite argument.
So if the deal still exists because most of the participants haven't withdrawn from it, the US can presumably rejoin it. Mm-hmm. As it stands. subject to agreement on which sanctions it's willing to remove? Is that the essence of the discussion, what the US is willing to concede on sanctions and what the Iranians are willing to accept? Is that basically in sort of crude, talking about transactional terms, but is that basically what it is coming down to?
Well, there is this element which is quite fundamental about the technical aspect of sanctions. There's another one, which is to make more demands on Iran. And this is what some of the hardliners in the Trump administration had been saying, which is there should be an additional agreement on ballistic missiles, which was not part of the earlier agreement. And then there is this word that has been used, which is this destabilizing activities of Iran in the region. So what some of the hardliners have been asking in the US was for Iran to stop meddling in the affairs of other countries in the region. And clearly, this is up to a point unacceptable for the Iranians because they've gained a lot of ground in Syria and elsewhere, and then they have close ties with the Hezbollah of Lebanon. And I don't see the Iranians saying, okay, we're going to stop intervening in all of those matters because this is regarded as part of the Iranian national interest. So here there's going to be probably some kind of an arrangement where there would be the appearance that there is something that was added to the deal without hitting too directly at what the Iranians perceive as being their national interest.
We've talked a lot about Iran and Saudi Arabia, Ibrahim. Maybe as my final question, I could ask you, do you have a sense of what kind of relationship the Biden presidency is going to have with Israel? Because that's clearly another critical one in the region. Any early signs of how you think that is going to bed down?
Well, the new administration has made it clear that there would be unwavering support for Israel in general. Okay, and that whatever gains Israel got would not go back on the negotiating table. At the same time, the Biden administration has stressed the fact that it is still committed to a two-state solution, and they expect to have some concessions on the part of Israel as far as the Palestinians are concerned. So probably on the question of annexation, which incidentally, it looks like more like a fig leaf to me than an actual decision. But during the normalization discussions between the UAE and Israel, the UAE kept stressing that they did get something in return from Israel, which is that their decision to annex the occupied territories would be, for the time being, suspended. So there was no renunciation to the idea of annexing occupied territories, but that this would be left for the future, actually. So on that front, one can expect the Biden administration to adopt a tougher line towards Israel on that subject and to try at least to extract some concessions for the Palestinians. The State Department under Donald Trump was completely sidelined. They were basically told whether we're dealing with Saudi Arabia or with the Arab-Israeli conflict is none of your business to be part of it, which is a strange position to be in. And so from that perspective, there is also something to rebuild in terms of bringing back the State Department in the game.
That was Ibrahim Warde, who's written about the new administration's Middle East policy in an article entitled Biden and Iran, Who Trusts Who? It's in the April 2021 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's also available at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again next month for another interview with one of our contributors. And until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.